Hi there, Vanguard fans. This is extremewirehead, and I'm going to go over another clan in the Vanguard world, letting you in on the intros to see how each clan operates inside and outside of the vacuum, how it works and interplays with other clans, and how to best understand this clan so that you know how to trip it up and how to take advantage of your strengths. In this video, I'm going to go look at Shadow Paladin and how they operate. And Shadow Paladin is one of those clans that you hear a lot about because it is considered one of the top tier decks. It is considered a very strong, very powerful deck, and that's for a number of different reasons. One, it's a paladin. Paladins have a tendency of having the ability to field quickly and being able to maintain large sets of fields, gain huge amounts of card advantage because of that field, and in general just are very easy to play with in that sense. Secondly, because they are Shadow Paladin, their special quirk on top of being a paladin and having the ability to field quickly is to spend that field and strengthen their vanguard in exchange for basically sacrificing their field. And it's an important consideration to make because it really does tell you a little bit about how they like to operate and how they choose to make their decisions, because they tend to only field as much as necessary to spend for a cost, essentially using up your entire field, giving the opponent not much to work with on their turn. This does mean that most of their defenses get pummeled into their hand, and at that point it is much more difficult to deal with. In the case of some clans, they will have ways to force it out of the hand, but you're going to have to go through special clans, and not everyone has those options. This puts Shadow Paladin in a very peculiar spot, strong position that allows them to hold on to their needs as much as necessary or let it all out and use an entire field if the option provides it. So, in general, you should understand that because they are Shadow Paladin and they like to sacrifice, the most important things will be the G3 and the G4. So let's get down to the G4. I'm only going to look at interesting or simple cards to let you understand how Shadow Paladin works, and I'm not going to go over the meta because that's a changing thing. Anyway, let's go down to the G4. Grim Recruiter. Grim Recruiter is one of those very simple cards, probably, if I remember correctly, one of the first cards to be released for them. When this unit attack hits a Vanguard, search your deck for a grade 1 or less and call to R. In the case of the Royal Paladins, they tend to focus on the G2. In the case of the Gold Paladins, they tend to focus on the top deck. And in the case of the Shadow Paladins, they tend to focus on the G1. Now, this is important because since the G1 isn't a front field attacker, you have more reason to spam call them, and it makes it much easier for you anyway, to drop them and retire them as necessary to sacrifice for your different effects. Important to note, this is a basic card that lets you in on those things, and since it's costless, it makes it much easier to get around, and probably something you should always be considering in case you're running a very expensive deck. Next card to look at is Elysian? Ephesian is the other starting stride. When you're starting out in the game, I highly recommend you take a look at Grim Recruiter and Ephesian, because they will tell you about the two different ways that Shadow Paladin operates. Grim Recruiter, obviously, as the name says, recruits onto the field, while Ephesian does the complete opposite. Choose a rear guard and retire it. When it is placed on Vanguard, pay the skill, gets plus power, and gets the skill if it hits the Vanguard, your opponent has to retire. Giving a special skill on the effect of retiring your own side of units is a very, very Shadow way of doing things, and you should note that they will tend to have effects like these where fun stuff happens after retiring. Now, in the case of Ephesian, it isn't as special because it happens during the stride phase and not the main phase or battle phase, but it's still an interesting thing to note because of the strength of the skill. It is particularly dangerous just because of how early you can get it off, and makes it so that the opponent is forced to pick things that are rather important to their field and break up a lot of synergies. Now, going down to all the other G4 aren't They're quite dependent on the strategy involved. The one G4 that you will probably be seeing a lot of because it came out in a TD and really does put into perspective how Shadow tends to end their games. This is a game ender by its very nature, and probably something that you might see every now and again. Axe skill, counter bless one, face up a copy of it, and if the number of face up is 2 or more until end of turn, this gets 10k and a crit. Vanguard skill, choose 3 of your rear guards and retire them when this unit attacks. So during the battle phase, you may pay the cost. If you do, your opponent must retire 2 rear guards. If he or she does not, your opponent cannot call from hand for guard. Now, Phantom Blaster Overlord really did change the way that Shadow had to think. Everything that Shadow does, at least at this point, is based around trying to get into a favorable position to use Phantom Blaster Diablo. Retire their side of the field, make it very difficult for them to maintain their hand, and in general, make it so that it's impossible to guard. Which is, the whole point. If they have to retire, then good. You've just made them drop 2 cards on top of having to guard. Very strong, very powerful effect, and one that really works with right about every single Shadow deck. That's the entire reason I have to show it, because it might show up even in the future when Stride isn't that big a deal, because of just how toolboxy the skill is and how open it is to sticking into different kinds of decks. Even if you don't focus on it, still something to consider, an especially potent finisher. Moving down to the G3, I'm only going to look at 2 cards because we're already looking at quite a few cards in this set. Claret Sword is one of those cards that didn't see a lot of play because he is he doesn't mesh well with a lot of strategies, and things that work for Claret tend to only work for Claret, which didn't make things any easier for them. His GB2 skill, the skill that he gets later on in the game, is choose 2 rearguards, retire them, gets 10k and a crit. Rather expensive, very similar to some of the old skills. Now, as I've mentioned before, a lot of what Shadow does is buffing up the G3 by sacrificing their friends in order to gain power. Very Paladin-esque and very, very Shadow. Now, getting power and crit for 2 units, quite normal. They've done it before in other cards, but it's only a GB2 skill, kind of limiting, and otherwise it is a bit costly, especially if you can't stride. You don't want to be reducing your field at the same time. The on-stride skill is on-stride CB1. If you do, search for a grade 1 or less, call it to R, shuffle your deck, and the unit called gets 2k. Now, it's basic, calls a G2, nothing special. Unlike the other cards in other clans, it does not necessarily increase the number of attacks onto your field, which makes it very awkward. But otherwise, because G1 is such an important thing in the Shadow deck, it is a very decent choice, especially since you can search straight from your deck. Going down to the second G3 that I was looking at, it's in the main. And the most important thing about the main is to show that it isn't all about power. In some cases, especially for the witches, they try to mix things up and add special effects that do other things, but a lot of them still hold on to that old idea of retiring things. In the case of the main, limit break, retire to stop retire basically on the opponent's turn, which can really screw up a lot of strategies because of how invasive it is. During your battle phase, you tend to have a planned order depending on how things go, and you suddenly just lose a unit all like that, and it's kind of annoying, very difficult to deal with, and probably something to watch out for. In many cases, a good way to get around this is attacking the rear guards, but I don't think you're going to see a lot of people playing Attain just because of how confusing the skill is and how limiting 10k can be nowadays. Still an interesting card, shows you that the breadth and the consistent differences in the ways that they're going to use these retires on their Vanguard will play into how the decks will run. They not only have special guards like noted above, they've got power plays in things like Claret Sword, and they've even got restands in some of the older cards. Something to watch out for, because everything will always involve killing things. If they can't kill anything, they're fresh out of luck. There are cases where you end the game where they run out of cards because they had to force the retires, the sacrifice required by dropping the rest of their hand. In a lot of cases, this does lead to them winning the game, but it is a basically all in. You're in because after that point, you're probably dead. Going down to the G2, to the next line of cards, we're going to look at how G2 plays into this whole thing because of the way that Shadow works. They really love their G1, and in the case of the cards, it really does shine. So, Wily Revenger Mana, sorry for the funky image, when this unit shows up on anywhere really, search your deck for G1, just call it for free as long as it's a Revenger. Now, this is the reason why this, I believe, is the reason why Revenger became such a strong deck early on in the maybe in the mid-teen years of Vanguard. It's because mana essentially is a free call. It does go back to the deck at the end of the turn. It doesn't matter, you're going to kill it before it reaches that point. It is completely worth the lack of power because it's only an 8k. And it does mean that you can make some crazy plays with just 2 cards in hand, 1 card in hand. It makes very cheap plays happen, calls important things. The calls on those things effects still go off even though they go back to the deck at the end of the turn. Very strong, very powerful. Now, you have to understand that mana is one of those key cards that really did make Revengers shine and Shadow in general. But the even older cards really showed off this whole thing about, I'm just going to kill things. The whole purpose of the deck sometimes was just things need to die constantly. And Skullwitch Nemain is probably one of those cards that really does show off how they think like that. Counterblast 1, choose a Shadow from hand and discard it when this is placed on R. If you have a Shadow Paladin Vanguard, pay the cost if you do draw 2 cards. Lots of cycle, lots of strength, and you're just going to retire it anyway, so you don't care if it's 3k. The only problem with this card is if you accidentally have to ride it, you're stuck with a 3k body, which is very, very dangerous for you. Something to watch out for. You won't see this card anymore in play, but you will see cards similar to this where they will involve killing their own units to gain advantage and gaining advantage for the fact that they killed things. It's a loop, just like many other clans. They have an engine that they work around, a system that cycles upon itself. And finally, we have Rukia. Rukia was another key card, but for a different build altogether. When you do call a G1 or less rear guard that essentially powers up Rukia. Everything basically revolves around the G1 if you haven't noticed. And Rukia just shows that you won't just be getting fancy effects, you won't just be drawing cards, you'll also be gaining power, which makes them very, very versatile and very, very strong in a holistic sense. Not much else to say about that. Power's power, you've seen it everywhere else. Going down to the G1, there's lots of different choices. A lot of them, though, tend to focus on being part of a subtype, so I don't want to run into it and spoil all the fun of you experimenting with the clan and seeing what you like, what you don't like. I will, though, talk about 2 cards that do show off the style in which a lot of these G1 play out into. The first one is, in my opinion, probably the best G1 in the Revengers subclan of Shadow Paladin, Darkbond Trumpeter. When it's called from into Vanguard or Rearguard, Counterblast 1, search for a G0 or less with Revenger in its name, and then call to R as Rest. Since it comes out as Rest, it doesn't get in an extra attack during the battle phase, which is all well and good because otherwise you could end up with maybe a somewhat an overpowered card, but it does field enough units for you to sacrifice. If you can wait an extra turn, it does become a serious plus, but otherwise you're just there for the extra units that you require in order to come out with your greater effects. Very strong card, very versatile, especially back in the day when I was playing around with some of the other G3s, and something that should always be in the back of your mind. Ever since then, they've been coming out with new trumpeters, new ideas for the Dark Bond, and how they field into the system without having to be limited to the Revenger archetype. I'll leave you to experimenting and discovering those cards on your own. Second G1 that I wanted to look at, something else, the last card really in the G1 that I wanted to look at is Danna. Danna is shows, just like I mentioned a while ago, the witches tend to be on the different side, and mana shows that sometimes the Vanguard can be very strange in how different they can be. The Shadow Paladins are split up into another subclan called the Witches, where they tend to change rear guards on the opponent's side into zeros. If you don't have any rear guards, then this is never a problem for you. But if you do, they can totally ruin it by essentially getting a free retire without really retiring, because you still get a zero out of it. It's dangerous, I would say, but it's not a game killing skill, and it does mean that you still have an extra attack on the side and something to, but it is something to watch out for, because they can pick out high value targets, switch them out with G0s, and make things difficult for you. Otherwise, you will probably not see this outside of a totally witches archetype because of the Vanguard requirement. It does play into a lot of the other skills in the deck, so I don't suggest leaving out G0s around, but that's only specifically for the witches. Going down to the last two cards, we're looking at the G0. Judge Bow was one of those cards that really did show off how powerful some of these effects with Shadow Paladin are. When it attacks and there was a phantom on the Vanguard, or on the one that hit basically in front of him, Counterblast 1, put it into Soul, choose 2 G1 or less Shadow Paladin, any Shadow Paladin, by the way, call them to R's Rest. You could call things like Darkbond Trumpeter, you could call things that I haven't shown here that add draws to your hand, make special effects happen. Lots of versatility, allows you to shuffle, cycle out, add Soul. Very strong card. There's a reason why every single Revenger probably uses this card, because if it's that good and that versatile. Going down to the last card. I know I keep saying down, it's just the list, that's why. Down to the last card is David, and David is one of those newer cards that really does make you think about the way that Shadow has been going. They've been increasing the number of things that they have to kill, the kinds of things that they have to kill in order to make greater and grander skills. And this does put a limit to you, because you've only got a certain amount of cards in hand, you've only got a certain amount of cards on field, and this card essentially tries to mitigate that a little bit. While you are retiring your rear guards for the cost of your unit's abilities, retiring this unit may be regarded as retiring 2 units instead. Now, that's very important, because Promising Knight David, since it is a starter, will always be there on the field. GB1 is not too late, and retiring something for 1 for 2, very cheap, and makes things very, very good for you, since you suddenly have an extra resource that showed up out of nowhere. I have no idea why he counts as 2, but he does count as 2. Sometimes just because you can retire their side doesn't necessarily mean they will not have enough. There are G1 versions of this. There are ways to get around retiring because of the number of things that they can do with limited resources, which makes them very difficult to deal with, even if you can touch their guard and their hand. But it's something to watch out for nonetheless, and does squeeze upon their requirements, which is a good thing. That basically rounds out my discussion on Shadow Paladin. It is a very strong clan because their engine is very difficult to get into. It's very hard to stop these effects from going off unless you can stop them from their hand or during their battle phase, making them a very top tier idea in concept. There is a reason why one of the big bads in the first season was using a Shadow Paladin, why it felt like an evil power because you killed your friends, and in general just is an awesome set. Lots of interesting G3s, lots of interesting G2s to look at, a lot of different choices for the G1s, which is important since you will have the ability to call a lot of them for almost free and have to retire them afterwards once their effects have gone off. Be careful of running out of G1s. There are very many cases where the number of G2s, the G1s you keep calling is insane, and then suddenly your deck is out of G1s. And there aren't many ways to filter back into the deck unless you've got Legion. This has been Extreme Wirehead, and I hope you enjoyed my talk on Shadow Paladin. I'll see you next time. Peace.